Mary Shelley was a teenager when she wrote Frankenstein. And in some ways, she saw the future more clearly than anyone in her time. Because Frankenstein isn't really a story about monsters. It's a story about scientists. About what happens when invention outpaces reflection. What if creation was never the sin, but abandonment was? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is often read as a story about horror or hubris. But I think it's a story about disconnection. About what happens when we create something powerful and then fail to care for it once it's out in the world. And that question, what happens after we create, might be one of the most important ones we can ask today. Because the truth is, we're all inventors now. Every tool, every system, every idea that we put out into the world keeps evolving without us. Today, I want to explore with you what Frankenstein teaches us about ethical design and what it means to stay responsible for what we make. From children, family, and communities, to global development projects that fail once funding runs out, all the way to medical devices that save lives in one country and gather dust in another. But this isn't just a story about bad systems either. It's about how we too abandon parts of ourselves. Our ideas, our empathy, and our curiosity. By the end of this video, I want to show you a way of thinking, one that engineers use regularly, that helps us build things and lives that we're less likely to abandon. Because I think the monsters that we create, whether in our labs or in our minds, aren't really asking for perfection. They're asking for responsibility. In biomedical engineering, you're trained to solve problems, to fix things. If the body breaks, we patch it. If a process is inefficient, we optimize it. If there's a gap between suffering and relief, we try to bridge it with technology. But what Mary Shelley understood, long before we had CRISPR or organ transplants or AI diagnostics, is that the act of creation carries moral weight. Victor Frankenstein doesn't create out of malice. He creates out of wonder, out of a genuine desire to understand and improve. But what ruins him isn't the experiment. It's his refusal to consult with his community or to take any responsibility for what he unleashes. And that feels familiar. In every field of design, especially ours, there's a temptation to think that building something is the same as helping someone. But that's not always true. Sometimes invention becomes a kind of tunnel vision. You can spend so long refining the prototype that you forget to ask who it's actually for. I've discussed many examples of groups of engineers designing low-cost medical devices for use in rural clinics in sub-Saharan Africa. And these generally work great in the lab, but then they fail out in the field. Why? Because access to electricity is unreliable, because the supply chain for spare parts doesn't exist, because no one has been trained to repair them. The engineers will build something extraordinary, but they build it for their world, not the one they're meant to serve. And that's the danger of what Shelley called the workshop of filthy creation. And that's where brilliant people disappear into their own heads, convinced that good intent is the same as good impact. There's a line in Frankenstein that haunts me, that actually inspired this video. After Victor brings his creature to life, he describes looking at it and feeling horror and disgust. He runs. He abandons it. He doesn't teach it or guide it or integrate it into the world. He just hides. And that's the moment the story becomes tragic. Not because of what he made, but because of what he refused to stay for. That same pattern plays out today. Aid organizations drop medical technologies off in developing regions and then vanish when funding dries up. Tech startups scale faster than their ethics teams. Pharmaceutical companies will patent a life-saving drug and then price it out of reach. We create and release and then retreat, just assuming the world will adapt to our inventions. But, as the creature says, "You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey." Our inventions eventually shape us back. They build the systems we live inside. They define who gets care, who gets left out, and what kind of world becomes possible. And when we ignore that feedback loop, when we don't stay to see what we've made, we risk creating monsters of our own. Frankenstein is often read as a warning against ambition, but I don't think Shelley was anti-science. I think she was anti-isolation. She was writing in the early 1800s, in a time when science was beginning to separate itself from philosophy, and medicine from morality. She saw what happens when creation becomes a solo act instead of a social one. Because real invention, ethical invention, is participatory. It asks, who is this for? Who's included in this design? And who bears the risk? This is something engineers still struggle with, because the systems we build often reflect the biases of the people building them. A diagnostic algorithm trained on Western data may perform poorly in other regions of the world. A medical device trained on male anatomy can fail on female patients. Clinical trials almost necessarily exclude entire populations, but then the resulting medications are marketed as universal. So the question can't just be what we create, but also who gets to create and who gets left out of that room. There's another question here that I just had a fantastic conversation with a few of my wonderful friends about. And it's the question of ownership. If you invent something life-saving, do you have a right to profit from it? Or does the world have a right to access it? This tension between innovation and accessibility is at the heart of modern medicine and bioethics. During the COVID-19 pandemic, wealthy countries secured vaccines years in advance, while much of the global south waited. Pharmaceutical companies defended their patents, arguing that innovation requires incentive. And they're not wrong. Without funding, research dies. But as a result, people died too. Victor Frankenstein didn't patent his creation. I actually think he did something much worse. He hid it. He refused to share knowledge that could have helped others understand what went wrong. And it hurt many people. That secrecy, that fear of exposure, becomes the moral failure of the book. In a way, intellectual property law is just a modern echo of that same fear, the instinct to protect the self over the system. And it raises the same question. Can innovation really be ethical if it's designed to exclude? The story of Frankenstein doesn't offer one clear moral. It's more like a mirror, reflecting back whatever era is reading it. To some, it's a warning against overreach. To others, it's a call for compassion, for seeing the humanity in what we create. And maybe both are true, because every system has multiple sides. The same curiosity that gives us vaccines also gives us surveillance. The same drive that builds prosthetic limbs can also build autonomous weapons. The difference isn't the technology, it's the integrity of the design process. Maybe Shelley wasn't warning us to stop creating. Maybe she was warning us to stay present after we do. So, how do we create differently? How do we avoid the loneliness of Frankenstein's lab? Maybe it starts with humility. The idea that invention isn't an act of genius, but of listening and iteration and failure. Some of the most successful medical technologies in the world came not from billion-dollar labs, but from teams that embedded themselves in communities, that asked nurses what they needed, that sat in clinics and watched how people improvised solutions when the system failed them. That's not charity. That's design intelligence. I think that's what Shelley meant by moral imagination. Building things with people, not just for them. And it's not easy. Trust me, I've made these mistakes before. It means slowing down. It means acknowledging your blind spots. It means measuring success not by the elegance of your design, but by the endurance of your impact. Towards the end of the book, even Frankenstein's monster begins to pity him. There's something very human about it. He recognizes that both of them were seeking knowledge and wisdom. Even the so-called monster understands that creation is a burden. Every engineer, every designer, every scientist carries a version of that burden, not to predict every consequence, but to care enough to try. Shelley's story endures because it reminds us that progress is not neutral. that innovation without empathy becomes destruction, that the responsibility of an inventor isn't just to create something new, it's to stay accountable for what happens next. So if you're building something, a tool, a company, or a system, don't run when it comes alive. Don't turn away when it stops behaving like you thought it would. Stay with it. Study it. Teach it. Repair it. Be responsible for the world that you make. Because in the end, I think that's what separates an originator from a creator. Thanks for watching. Build carefully and stay human.